dark side. Light this bitch up.
What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. We are continuing Plymouth Brethren Christian Church week here on Blackballed, and today we have a very, very, very interesting guest. Sometimes when I take a look at these ex-members that I've been getting to know over the past year, I have to remember that while I see many similarities in all of their stories, especially when it comes to alienation from family members and things like that, I always have to remind myself quietly that each one of these stories are unique in their own specific way. And my guest today has like 3 or 4 things that really differentiates his story from others. And I really wanted to have him on the show. So if you would please welcome my guest today. His name is Bradley McCallum. Bradley, how are you, buddy?
Good, thank you, James.
I'm
Glad
really happy to have you on the show today because I've watched the podcast that you did with the Get a Life crew, and I've talked to you a little bit, and reading about some of the things that you've gone through and listening to it has been really eye-opening. But I want to do what I normally do in these situations and start from the beginning. Where did you grow up, and what was your early childhood like?
Yeah, I grew up in Detroit. So Southeast Michigan, in the meeting that was called Detroit. We didn't live actually in the city. We lived in a suburb. We did live in the city, but when the neighborhood started to become integrated and change, and crime started to rise in the city, the Brethren all bolted and moved to the suburbs. But even as a kid, that seemed really weird to me, that we were going to just cut and run, but we did. My childhood, and particularly, I'm 52. My childhood, I've realized in talking to a lot of people that I grew up with, honestly, my childhood was very sheltered in comparison to most of the Brethren kids of that era. It was honestly quite happy. My father was very distant and kind of remote, I would say, cerebral and kind of remote and distant. My mother was definitely the woman in charge in the house, not openly to the rest of the world. My dad was clearly the man in charge, but my mother was the woman who ran the place. She kept us kids in line and dealt old-fashioned kind of 1950s discipline.
Yeah.
To us. I had 2 sisters. My parents are both gone, but it was actually a very happy childhood. My mother had a terrible accident it's actually 39 years ago today. It was in 1984, where she and I were walking to the meeting, which was walking to church, and a motorcycle hit her when we were crossing the street. Oh. She was really terribly injured, survived, but was an invalid the rest of her life. So, wow. That other than that, I mean, which created a lot of challenges for us as a family. It was great. My sisters both married really wonderful guys, who I honestly can't say a bad word about. I mean, obviously they're not very. They're all still in. I'm the only person in the family that is outside. But my brother-in-laws and my sisters have been nothing but nice and kind and lovely, except for distant, not wanting to talk to me. And I know that sounds oxymoronic, but
you know what? It sounds human. And the reason why, just for listeners that may not be up to speed on the type of circumstances that happen to people when they leave or when they're forced out, is I always find it really interesting when ex-members of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church have empathy for the family that remains, despite the fact that there is that distance and lack of communication. Is that because you know what they're going through?
I think so. They're believers in the system.
Mhm.
You know, there's the term believer that most people in mainstream society refer to as believers in Christianity, but I use the term believers and they believe in the Plymouth Brethren thing, which is, I believe, different than normal mainstream Christianity. They believe in the system. They believe in the system. They believe in the leaders. They are very, very strongly, but they're also very nice people, and they've
Yeah.
never been mean to me. They've never been real. They've never been like some people have dealt with really terrible relatives and family members. I have not experienced that. My dad accepted,
Yeah.
but my siblings and the other part, my in-law, my brothers-in-law, no, they've been wonderful people, but they're believers, so they will have nothing to do with me. So that's kind of sad.
You mentioned your dad being distant. Is there, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to pause on the chronology for a second because I kind of want to get to your teenage years and then your 20s. But I'm wondering about the Aberdeen incident and how, if that had a long lasting impact on your family, and if you could explain what that incident was for my audience who may not be familiar with it.
Yeah, it did. It had a, I mean, my upbringing and my growing up, I was, so, so in
Sure.
1970, so the Brethren have this figure, they have for 100 plus years, have had a figure that is kind of like the Brethren Pope. I mean, for lack of a better word, it's this sort of person that is looked to for leadership and guidance. Um, and in the 50s, there was this kind of long kind of period interregnum where the leader had died in 1952 or 1953, and there was this long sort of period until 1960 where it was unclear as to who was the next leader, and there was a lot of thought that maybe there wasn't going to be another one single leader. Maybe it was going to be a group thing, a mutual thing. Um, but there emerged at the end, which we can talk about or not at some point, in 1960, the leader who had died in 1952 or 1953, his son kind of emerged
This
as
is
the
Jim
dominant.
Taylor that died, and then his son Jim Taylor Jr. took over.
Correct, yeah.
Right.
So Mr. Taylor Jr. took over. It was a very I mean, all of these guys that kind of run that are very very prominent all have this element of charisma about them. Some of them it's there's different elements of charisma, or there's different aspects of it. And some are, but I mean, from what I understand, both of the Taylors were very charismatic, but in different ways. But anyway, in 1960, he kind of solidified his hold on the thing, and then through the 60s, there was a lot of kind of controversial stuff that happened. And then leading up to kind of building to a crescendo, it was kind of growing and growing and growing. Um, there was a lot of pretty objectively speaking,
Yeah.
pretty, I mean, I wasn't even alive, but I mean, it was pretty awful shit that was happening in 68, 69, and then definitely into 1970. And in 1970, there was a conference in Aberdeen, Scotland. My grandfather, who at the time would have been largely thought of as maybe number two under Mr. Taylor. So they were all there. My grandfather, Mr. Taylor, there. Everyone was in Aberdeen for this big conference, and Mr. Taylor was like spending a lot of time. His wife was in New York. She had not come to Aberdeen, so he was there alone, and he was spending a lot of time. So he stayed with his brother by the name of James Alec Gardner in Aberdeen, and he was spending a lot of time in his bedroom alone with a young married woman from the Brethren. You know, who he claimed she was a nurse, and he claimed she was ministering to him and um, attending to his needs and whatnot. Um, Mr. Gardner became so concerned about it that he eventually asked my grandfather, who was also at the conference but staying at someone else's house, um, to come over and kind of deal
Intervene.
with it,
Yeah.
intervene,
Yeah.
intervene, intervene.
Yeah.
So my grandfather so the conferences were typically Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So on Saturday night, after this had been going on for several days, my grandfather shows up and uh, with Mr. Gardner goes up to Mr. Taylor's bedroom, knock on the door, and then they go in. And Mr. Taylor is in bed wearing nothing but a pajama top. So he was naked. He was not naked because he had a pajama top on, but I mean, he was naked otherwise.
He was naked where it counts.
Mrs. Kerr, who was, I think, 31 or 32, was in bed completely naked. The clothes were scattered all around the floor. And my grandfather, I don't know the exact verbiage of it all, but there's contemporaneous diary accounts and letters and different things that were written within that same week where, I mean, essentially he was like, Jim, because my grandfather and Mr. Taylor had known each other most of their adult lives. So my grandfather had immigrated from Scotland in the 20s when he was around 20, and had become very quickly kind of affiliated with the Taylors and had been very close to Mr. Taylor Sr. And so, I mean, him and Jim Taylor had known each other intimately since they were young men. And he said something along the lines of, like, Jim, what would Renee think? Meaning Mr. Taylor's wife.
Yeah.
And Mr. Taylor said, well, I suppose you're going to go and tell her, aren't you? And this was witnessed to by not only Mr. Gardner, but there were a couple other people standing there and who heard this exchange.
So
and
Mr. Gardner is not the husband of Miss Kerr, though, right?
No, he is the owner of the house where Mr.
Oh, right.
Staying.
Okay.
So they actually, so to me that says it all. Like, that was not like, aha, Mr. McCallum, I finally got you. You finally confronted me and charged me. Like, because afterwards, Mr. Taylor tried to claim that this was all a setup, that this was all an ambush, that this was all some carefully choreographed, divinely sanctioned plan to draw out my grandfather and all the other people that opposed Mr. Taylor and make them charge him with corruption.
To remove him as leader and to insert someone else?
Yeah, and it's like, well, no, but you were. Like, you were in bed with a young married, like, it's not like they were making this shit up. You were doing it.
And this guy, Jim Taylor Jr., from what I've read and been told about, because you talked about how there were scandals that were building in the 60s, basically, he kind of treated his position as leader of the Plymouth Brethren as almost like he was a rock star, right? Like he was charismatic, but in a way, like he even sang. Like he was apparently a really good singer, and he was like charismatic and he liked to party, and he was sort of like fashioned himself as a ladies' man. Like he was kind of like the first rock star leader of the PBCC, wasn't he?
Well, he that's a funny way of describing him, but he really took, so like his father, James Taylor Sr., like led the Brethren for over 50 years and was this very sober, very stately, regal. I mean, he had arrived in America, penniless Irish immigrant. He worked his way he got a job in the linen. He ended up first in Canada. I think he came over when he was like 12 or 14 or something, really young. Ended up in Canada somewhere, then ended up in New York City, but got a job in the linen industry and worked his way up and made a fortune. In the early 1900s, you could do that. Late 1800s, early 1900s, you could make a fortune in America. I mean, it was like but he took extreme pains to kind of, because the Irish in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s were really looked down on. They were very much the lower class. They were the dregs. But Mr. Taylor Sr. worked very hard to present himself, both in his demeanor and in his way of life, as being this kind of old money wasp, essentially.
Okay.
He
That's called hustling. He's a hustler.
He conducted himself with great decorum and deportment, he eventually, through the years, ended up in this gigantic house in Brooklyn where a lot of Irish and Jewish immigrants lived. Kind of the second tier of society, but he ended up in this gigantic house with servants and like carved furniture and oriental rugs and like just really amazing. I mean, and then he would travel to Europe all the time. Firstly, he was doing it kind of on the back of his business because he would go over there on linen buying trips, but he would also like serve at conferences and things.
Can I ask you, sorry, just to cut you off for a second, was he a member of the Brethren at this time?
Yes,
Okay.
he joined when he was very young, like in his teens.
Okay. Because that's a unique departure from what I usually hear about, which is almost everybody is born into it.
Yeah, no, he joined, but he actually might have had some connection with the Brethren in Ireland. So he was from this area called Cooleeney or in Sligo, something like that, where there were a lot of Brethren connected people.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if he was actually in fellowship or not. But anyway, but he assiduously worked his way up the ladder very effectively. And he had no formal education other than, the most basic kind of high school. But if you like read his writings or read his transcribed meetings where he, addresses where he spoke or Bible readings. I mean, he was very eloquent. He was clearly a highly intelligent guy. But anyway, he built this whole thing, and then he married. His first wife died. He kind of married up multiple times. Like he married his first wife was quite socially above where he had sort of entered the world, and then he married up again to this woman from England. And he lived this very kind of affluent, semi-aristocratic life, like some sort of like well-behaved duke, or duke and duchess. Whereas JT Jr. or Mr. Taylor Jr. Really didn't behave like that. Once he got into the 60s and started achieving some sort of recognition as leader, it all sort of went off the rails pretty damn quick. Like, you look at his written and oral ministry in the 50s and early 60s, it's actually very mainstream in Brethren thought, which was just highly conservative Christian shit. And then in the mid 60s, it just completely goes cuckoo. It goes completely off the rails. And that's when he starts all this personal misbehavior. Like, he's clearly drinking way too much. He disappears in the mid 60s for months. And even my dad, who was like a complete dyed-in-the-wool supporter, believed it was some treatment to do with alcohol consumption. My father would never have called him an alcoholic.
The first thing I think of when I hear about people that have an alcohol problem disappearing for months on end is cocaine. It's really honestly what I think of. Like,
Yeah.
and I know people that have had secret cocaine habits for years where no one knew. Like, if you found out that Jim Taylor often complained about allergies, I'm certain he had a cocaine problem. Do you know what I mean? Like, but anyway, sorry. Go on.
And he also reportedly, there was a lot of talk in the mid 60s, where he went to Europe and he kind of disappeared for a period of time, like a week or 2 weeks or something in Paris, where they like found him with like hanging out with like courtesans and shit. Like, so how much of it's true, how much of it's not? I just think where there's smoke, there's usually some sort of a
Cocaine.
there's some there's something causing the smoke,
Yeah.
and it's not everyone making this shit up. Particularly when it's people like my dad who like thought that, he deserted his own father over this whole shit and threw in his lot completely with with Mr. Taylor Jr. But
So he gets
still,
caught. He gets caught in bed with Miss Kerr, and then he kind of finagles
so
conspiracy. Sorry.
he says he basically quickly very so he gets caught in bed. Mr. Gardner tells the Kerrs they got to get out of his house. They got to leave. So they go out and like literally sit in the freaking yard. I think they might be alive, so I want to be cautious about what I say about them.
Okay.
I believe they go out and just sit in the yard or sit on the curb or something, and they just go
Was
outside.
Mr. Kerr not like out for blood?
No, he was fully endorsing this whole thing.
Jesus. That's
He
like
was
a
like,
Warren Jeffs kind of scenario, isn't it?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And then my grandfather goes and calls, I believe it was my grandfather or someone associated with my grandfather, goes and calls James Taylor III, who was somewhere in Scotland. He was not in Aberdeen. For some reason, he was not at Aberdeen during the course of these conferences. So James, Scotland's not very big. So James gets in a car and hustles his ass over to Aberdeen. Gets there sometime in the early morning. And they also call a doctor, and some doctor shows up, some Brethren doctor, and like says Mr. Taylor's really sick, and gives him injections of some sort, which is a Brethren favorite, giving people shots of one thing or another.
Yeah.
And then they fly him out of there. They get his ass out and back to New York. So they get him to the airport and they fly him home. The conference in Aberdeen wraps up on Sunday. My grandfather and the other people that are there kind of finish up the meetings. But in that interim period from Saturday night to like Monday, Tuesday, JT Jr. comes up with this concept that it's all a divinely approved plan that was an ambush to draw out his enemies. And he gets back to New York and he aggressively prosecutes this concept that it's an ambush and that anyone who doesn't see it is impure. And he uses the scripture, to the pure all things are pure, and to the impure all is impure. So like he's basically saying my grandfather and everyone else who saw impurity in the bedroom and him being naked in a bed with a young married woman and their clothes scattered all over the room, that was evidence that they themselves were impure. It's so stupid.
It's like a shell game
so
of morals.
stupid.
Yeah.
It's so dumb. It
Yeah.
is so it's like hard to. So he gets back to New York, but the crazy thing is like almost all of the Brethren in Scotland leave the Brethren.
Yeah, there was a mass exodus. Yes.
Like in the thousands.
Mm.
And in New York, almost all of the meeting leaves. Like 2/3, 3/4 of the meeting leaves the Brethren. So the people that left at Aberdeen, which is what this whole crisis is usually referred to as, are the people who either saw the shit happen or who knew him the best.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, you know what? Enough is enough. This shit's. This is. No. This is a bridge too far. We're out.
Mm-hmm.
In other parts of the world, Australia, New Zealand, the West Coast, different parts of America, I think people bought into his charisma and bought into this story. I mean, my grandfather wasn't particularly beloved other than, a kind of a small subset of people. And then JT Jr. very quickly promulgated with the help of a bunch of, the small group of people. They quickly started spreading the thing that my grandfather was a homosexual pedophile. So, like, my question is like, if you knew this,
Yeah.
why did you wait until he found you in a bedroom naked with a young woman to start telling everyone?
Yeah. How many fictitious boys had to be raped by your grandfather in order for,
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
Or like, if you all knew this shit, why didn't you bring it up before?
and your
Because
yeah,
if you wanted to remove him,
Mhm.
if you wanted to quote unquote draw out his, you had a, so it was bullshit. And so my father and my uncle, so my family was completely split apart. My dad and uncle stayed with Mr. Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
My aunt and my grandparents were kicked out. Mr. Taylor's children, his James III stayed with him. Ben, his other son, left, supporting my grandfather. So they're completely split apart. But my dad and my uncle that stayed with Mr. Taylor went to the police in Ontario because some of this stuff they alleged happened in Ontario, because Detroit, being just across the border, was in constant sort of interchange with meetings in Ontario.
Sorry, they went to the police for what?
To charge my grandfather with homosexuality, which was still a crime in Ontario and in Michigan.
Wow. So his own son.
So his own sons went to the
Wow.
police in Ontario and said he was not only a homosexual, which was criminal, but he had also behaved inappropriately with these boys. The Crown prosecutor, came back and told them that they better get lawyers for themselves. So he looked into it, the Crown
Yeah.
prosecutor. He came back and was like, you better get lawyers for yourselves. Because if you pursue this, you're going to be the ones that end up charged with false charges.
Wow.
So they dropped it instantly.
Yeah.
Just,
Okay.
they're like, oh no, we're good.
Your father being distant then, was he kind of
So he
mistreated because of his last name by Taylor after that?
He was 29 at the time. I think this thing completely shook him to the foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there was some thought that James III was going to be the next leader, and then that didn't happen, and Mr. Simonton became the leader, and then this whole other regime started. But the whole charges against my grandfather as being a homosexual and pedophile and all this stuff really kind of tarnished the family name. And my father just kind of, I think, retreated into himself. I think it so badly damaged his sense of, like, his world. It was completely and utterly, like, disruptive to him and his mind. At the same time, there was this stuff happening in Detroit that's completely unbrethren related.
Yeah.
That I think also played a role in completely destabilizing my parents. And that was, so there was this huge change when the US government outlawed housing segregation. Cities like Detroit, which were in many ways more segregated than the southern cities,
Yep.
through rights of covenant and things like that on houses, preventing blacks and Jews from owning houses in white neighborhoods. And once that was all abandoned, these neighborhoods in Detroit where we lived just started to change, like, wildly fast. Like, neighborhoods change over time. In Detroit, it happened just at lightning speed. And so this world that he had, and the Brethren are racist, which we can get back to in a minute, but
Yeah.
the Brethren are, they believe that whites should live where whites live and blacks should live where blacks live. And so
I got that. I got that impression over the year.
they use the scripture that, the peoples of the earth and the boundaries of their dwellings. That's the scripture that is used, that peoples of the earth, like the whites, should live where whites live, Asians should live where Asians live. Anyway, but this whole shit that was
Can I just say one thing really quickly, is that, which is hilarious, because they probably think Jesus was white,
and he was
the only European ever, like in the Middle East,
That's right. He was the only white Palestinian. It's amazing.
That's right.
But so there was all this shit going on in our school in Detroit. So moving into the early, so this, and then in 1967, there was these, there was kind of what's sometimes called the rebellion, or these race riots in Detroit,
Right.
where finally the army had to be called in, the U.S. Army had to be called in to, like, quell the violence. And my father at the time was at the Levites meetings in England, so he was abroad at Bristol, going to the meetings with Mr. Taylor. My mother was home with my sisters. I was not born yet. And, there's paratroopers on the streets, and there's, like, shooting going on, and there's houses being burned and stuff. And that really freaked them out. But my dad was determined to stay. And then, so then moving on, we get into 1970. There's all this Aberdeen stuff happening. But like, just to give you an idea of the scope of change, by the early 70s, 73, 74, my sisters, I was not yet in school. I was 4, but my sisters, we went from having one black family in our school to the next school year, my sisters being the only white kids in the entire school in one school year.
Right.
So the societal change was so dramatic and so rapid that I think it really destabilized my parents. And I think that that combined with all the crises within the Brethren uh, completely just freaked my dad out. And I don't think he ever recovered, to be honest.
Yeah, the disrupting force that the Plymouth Brethren seem to have intergenerationally when it comes to trauma, when it comes to not being able to produce the type of natural faculties that you would need in order to sustain a normal life and a normal communications with your family. It can't be overstated, can it?
I agree.
Okay, so let's go back to you then. You're in your teens. You're inside the Brethren. Can you give me? Can you kind of just sort of chronologicalize what life was like between the time that you were a teenager and the time that you left? Like, just to sort of give people an idea of the process, because I understand there's I've been able to sort of ascertain, and I'm very much generalizing here, that there are often two types of ex-members. They're the type that leave on their own accord because they've had this instinct for years, and it culminates, and eventually they leave. And then there's the kind that just get boom cut off, and their whole life gets turned upside down, and they're forced out. Can you sort of take me along
Yeah.
that ride?
Yeah. So I from the time I was young, very young, there was a lot of stuff that didn't make any sense to me about the Brethren thing, like that not listening to pre-recorded music if it were not offensive or Christian music. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand the ban on travel, and I didn't understand a lot of things like that. So I read obsessively. I became really kind of not introverted, but I kind of lived in my head a lot. I read obsessively for years. Um, I became convinced very early in my life that the Brethren were not right. Um, that there was a screw loose somewhere,
Yeah.
and I didn't really know what it was. But then in my teens, I was working for my dad, and my dad had several companies, and I concluded that I should just buckle down. And there's this stuff inside the Brethren that they're told if you don't understand it, don't oppose it. If you
How
don't
convenient.
understand it,
Yeah.
just pray for light and things like
Yeah.
that. So I became convinced I should do that, and I would just work really hard at being a poster child. So I worked really hard at doing that. I read a lot of ministry. I behaved. I didn't do a lot of the shit that all these other people I find out later
Yeah.
we're all doing. They were drinking, they were going to the movies, they were fooling
Yeah.
around with girls, and it was just, yeah. My life was very, very sheltered that way. My father was deeply anti-drinking. Um,
It sounds like you had a great mom, though.
my mom was great, and my
Mm.
dad, honestly, he literally never raised his voice at me in my life. He never struck me. He also, in contrast to a lot of Brethren families, he was deeply anti-drinking. He was deeply anti. He was really promoted study and learning and healthy living, getting to bed early, getting up early. So it was very Victorian kind of.
Yep.
So my parents were lovely to me, in all honesty. Distant. My dad was very distant, but they were very kind, honestly. But I just began to lose belief in the system. But then I said, I'm just gonna hunker down. I'm gonna. So through my mid-teens, I really focused on doing that.
Mm.
and I stayed out of trouble, and a lot of other Brethren kids are getting in and out of trouble for various things, and I didn't, I didn't. Probably missed out on a lot of growing up fun, but I
Apparently.
didn't. I lived a very straight-laced life. Anyone who knows me growing up will tell you that I was the most straight-laced of the straight-laced, and I can concur. And then when I was 18, I had taken up this interest in this young sister, young Brethren lady, as being a potential wife. And she was JT Jr.'s granddaughter, and I was S. McC's, Stanley McCallum's grandson, and she was James Taylor Jr.'s granddaughter. And that there was some interest in that aspect of it, but also she was beautiful, and she was like, from everyone that knew her, I had never spoken to her, but from everyone that knew her, when I could observe at conferences and meetings, she was like sparkling personality. She had a big personality. So I decided I wanted to try and get to know her, but I was so concerned about following the rules that I decided I would then ask for permission from the authorities to write her a letter.
Wow.
So,
Sorry, I'm
like
laughing. It's not funny, really, in hindsight.
it's so stupid. It's so
Yeah,
stupid.
yeah.
It's so stupid.
Like, who was leader at the time? Was that John Hales that was leader at the time?
John Hales.
Yeah. Okay.
And
he probably didn't even know either of you. Like, that's the funniest part.
Well, he knew my dad really well, because my dad had a lot to do with him in the 50s and 60s when they were both much younger. So he knew my father really well. And then he knew Brenda, I shouldn't. He knew my ex-wife because, so the guy who was taking like responsibility, or was like the man in charge in Detroit, which was the locality I grew up in at the time, was also Mr. Taylor's grandson.
Okay.
So John Hales had been to Detroit for 3-day for a conference, which we called 3-day meetings. Sometime not long before this, when I got this interest, and my ex-wife had been in the leader's house, like helping as a household helper for the conference, where Mr. Hales stayed. I'm trying to. It all sounds so convoluted, but
no,
we'd have these conferences, and everyone would stay in Brethren houses. So
I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that
Yeah.
when Bruce, like Lane Admiral told a story about when Bruce went to a 3-day conference in Montreal that he stayed at his parents' house, right?
Yeah,
Like,
so
yeah.
the leader who was kind of like chairing the conference would always stay at the local leader's house.
Okay.
And the local leader would always have sometimes 1, 2, 3 various Brethren girls to help as servers, and help prepare the food and help prepare the rooms and do all this stuff. They'd be kind of like household assistants. And
Right.
so there'd been this conference in Detroit where Mr. Hales had served as the kind of the leader or the chair of the conference, and had stayed with the then leader Rick Wilson, and my ex-wife had been in the house, but she was Rick's first cousin. So they were so anyway.
Yeah.
A lot of background. So Mr. Hales knew who she was. Mr. Hales knew my dad. But so I asked Rick Wilson, I'd like to write my this young lady a letter. He's like, well, I think you should call Mr. Hales and ask him. Rick is still alive, and I'm sure he meant well, but he was a dick. Anyway, so I call.
I love the long pause. You're like, what should I? He was a dick. Okay, go on.
Yeah, he really was. Like, if there's anyone deserving of that title, yeah. So I called Mr. Hales, because at that time, apparently it's all different now, but at that time you could just pick up the phone and call to, like, the Brethren Pope. You could literally just pick up the phone and call him.
I've been trying to get Bruce Hales' phone number for a year.
Yeah, that's all different now. But
Yeah.
mind you, this was in 1987 or 88.
Mm-hmm.
So I got, somebody had his number, and so my dad was like, my dad being distant, but he wanted to be involved in this. So he's like, I'm going to be on the phone. I'm like, okay, great, thanks. So I called Mr. Hales, and he answered the phone, and he was very nice, but very brief. It was maybe a 3-minute conversation. He just kind of checked out who I was. He's like, oh, I know Garth, and my dad was on the phone, and he's like, oh yeah, and they kind of chatted for a minute. And then he says, so who is it you're interested in? And I told him who, and he's like, oh yeah, I know her, yeah. So I said, look, I don't know her. I've never spoken to her. I would like to write her a letter.
That's so cute, by the way. Like you're like 18, but like that's what I remember. Like that's what I did in grade 3. Do you know what I mean? Like, teacher, do you think it's okay if I write Andrea Schult has a love letter? And she would be like, yes or no, kind of thing. But it's interesting because it's not an arrested development. It's just that you were so sheltered, like you said, and you were trying to be a rule following person inside the
Yeah.
cult, right? So yeah, go ahead. That's interesting.
So he says, well, what I think you should do is wait. Oh, he asked how old she was, and I said she's 17.
Hmm.
And he said, well, what I think you should do is wait until she is 18 and then get married straight away.
Did anyone call Brenda and ask her what she thinks?
I did after the call.
Okay.
So
Jesus.
we get off the phone. I kind of gulped and was like, okay, all right, well, thank you. I get off the phone and my dad said, well, you know what to do. It's pretty clear. You've been given directive. And being the good rule following son, I call her father's house and ask to speak to Brenda. And she gets on the phone and I explain who I was, which she knew, and I mean, we knew of each other. We just hadn't really
Yeah.
personally. So I told her what Mr. Hales had said, and she said, okay.
Wow. That is
Um,
like so many different things. It's scary. It's weird. It's peculiar, but it's also indicative of that sort of chauvinist culture, isn't it?
yeah.
You know, just
You
deciding
know,
the rest of the life for this person who you
you know,
marry.
and
You know,
I honestly don't know if Brenda actually had any interest in me. I don't know if she ever had any interest in marrying me. I really don't.
yeah,
But she's a remarkable woman. I will say that she has been a fantastic mother to our children. She is the believer's believer in terms of being a brethren.
yeah.
She is a poster child for a good brethren person. Um, and I have nothing ill to say about her whatsoever.
Okay.
And honestly, like I say, I don't know if she had any interest in me or had any interest in marrying me, but she did what she felt should do. And
So I think.
there's something to be admired about that, honestly. But
Well,
it's
I mean,
kind of
from what I'm listen, and I know what you mean because the people that I've spoken with, it's interesting how the brethren men and the brethren women inside have completely different fates and destinies and lives and different experiences. And I often notice that there seems to be a quiet, while there's certainly a discipline and a loyalty that both men and women share in common when they're still inside. But there also often seems to be and I'm not saying that your ex was like this necessarily, but I noticed the strain of rebelliousness quietly emerge inside many women, but they don't act on it, it seems like. But they
okay.
know that there is an unfairness happening and they just kind of stay with it. And it feels like that's a common life cycle for a brethren woman.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, so you have kids
So we
and
get
let's
married,
yep,
and
go
we
ahead.
had 5 children in 6 years,
That poor Brenda.
which
Go ahead.
almost broke my ex-wife.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just an absolutely horrific physical strain on her.
Yeah.
I was completely immersed in my dad's businesses and working an ungodly amount of hours, and it was just an incredibly challenging period of our lives. So by this point, fast forward to our late 20s. So my ex was a year younger than me. So by this time in 97, I was 27. She would have been 26. So 27, 28, 26, 27. We're into this period. I completely lost faith in the Brethren thing. So the leader at the time in Detroit, who was running the show, led this campaign. There was a group. There was kind of these different groups of brethren that were kind of. It was kind of common in a lot of meetings in North America, where there was people who were very kind of towing the line and adhering to the John Hales directives and stuff. Because John Hales emerging on the scene in the late 80s kind of saw, at least in our areas, um, kind of this renewal of sort of more traditional, almost like 1950s Brethren values, like studying the scriptures, not drinking, being much more focused on sort of more traditional Christian living, which it had all gotten kind of badly off the rails, particularly during Mr. Symington, who was the prior leader's um, long period of illness. It had all gotten kind of pretty fucked up and kind of screwed up. And then John Hales emerged on the scene, and everything kind of he kind of promoted this, and he kind of like Rick Wilson in Detroit. He lived the life he preached. I mean, lived in a tiny, simple house. He drove an ancient car. He drank tea.
Yeah.
He was just this very kind of, and it was very inspiring. My father, who never, after 1970, had never really become a leader again, but he was always kind of right there underneath the leadership. Um, and he was just this huge John Hill supporter. And so we were living this kind of, this kind of austere lifestyle. And Rick Wilson, there was a whole contingent. So there was the contingent of people. Most meetings had these three groups of people. There was a contingent who were like on board and living this kind of monk-like life. There was always a group of people who were this like 1950s brethren who were like, yeah, kind of maybe, they had nice houses, they had nice cars, but they were still coming to meeting and they were behaving, but they liked nice things. And then there were the people who were like half out,
Yeah.
they had 1 foot out and they were, doing stuff. And he led this whole campaign in Detroit and got rid of, and eventually withdrew. We withdrew from this whole swathe of brethren in Detroit, like, I don't know, a quarter of the meeting, for being worldly. And there are people I really liked. They were
Yeah.
lovely, and most of whom I'm friends with now today. They were just fantastic people, and I was like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, we literally are railing these people out instead of like appealing to bring them in. We're like literally like on a campaign to get them out. Um, and then just over literally, and then my dad was doing shit in the business. So he was doing two things. One was he ran the money for the meeting in Detroit. Detroit was a wealthy meeting. So some meetings were really poor and didn't have much money.
Can you explain for our audience that aren't familiar with what you mean by that, by the money at the meetings and what that
Oh,
means?
so like when I say a meeting, so there were like essentially like dioceses.
Yeah.
So like the Brethren Diocese of Detroit, which comprised of 5 different meetings in different like satellite suburbs. Um, and so each meeting had someone who was in charge of the money, who would like, um,
And that would be money that members
there
of
would be
the
collection money and
yeah.
donation money. So
It's
there
sort
would
of
be
a, just so my audience understands, it's sort of a cross between Church on Sundays and The Sopranos, right?
a little
Basically.
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to draw some parallels with the Catholic Church. So like
Yeah.
obviously it's nowhere near as big or as rich as the Catholic Church, but
Mhm.
you have a diocese like Detroit. And then you have these subsidiary things that feed money in to the central the central diocese, and then the money is distributed from there. And it could be donations, it could be bequests from wills, it could be just collection basket money. And my dad was the guy who collected all that and then divvied it up. But it was all done into white envelopes. So
That's where the Sopranos come in. Yeah.
yeah, that was very Soprano-like.
Yeah.
So we'd get all these thousands of dollars, and then I would help him. He would be like, can you help me? And so we would like count out these stacks of money, and we would like put, some stacks would go to Sydney, and some stacks would go to this person, some stacks would go here, and some stacks would go there, and some stacks would go there, and then some stacks would go into the Detroit purse for use for whatever we needed to do. And that just started to feel really weird to me.
Yeah.
My mid to late 20s, I'm just like, yeah, this doesn't feel right.
This is a little gangsta. Like, it really is. Yeah.
We would literally be sitting at my dad's dining room table, and there would be like stacks. And I am not kidding, and I'm not exaggerating. There would be literally stacks of cash all over it, and we'd be stuffing envelopes and writing names, and then that would all be distributed at Brethren conferences. So it would not be like wired or mailed in some sort of normal fashion. It would be literally handed. My dad would take it and hand it to Joe, who would hand it to Sam, who would hand it to Bob, who would then Johnny would get on a plane to England, who would then take it over and give it to Frank, who'd then fly to Sydney. So like it was all done literally in envelopes of cash. And I did a calculation in my teens, and I'm like, okay, Detroit's a rich community, and we deal with more money than most places do. But even if we took an average, there is an astounding amount of money being circulated completely out of under the radar, or out of the reach of the authorities, because it was all in cash. So there was that, and my dad just started doing stuff in business that I didn't agree with. Tax. I will say tax avoidance.
Right. Now, were they using tax shelters as a religion back then?
Sorry?
Were they using religious-based tax shelters back then? No?
No, but a lot of the businesses were doing stuff that I think the most generous description could be described as tax avoidance.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think a lot of it probably crossed the line into other. And so, like for instance, there was also stuff like when my mother had this terrible accident in 1984 that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And the Brethren at that time in the 80s were not allowed to have health insurance. So, my mother had this ginormous medical bill.
Can I ask why? Was it because of the like Jehovah's Witness type thing, like God will take care of you? Is it that kind of thing? Okay.
But there was no network inside. There was no formalized network inside the Brethren to take care of you. You're just kind of on your own. But Mr. Symington, who was the leader at the time, told my dad, his exact words were, do whatever you need to do to qualify your family for Medicaid.
Was that because he had so many health issues, you think?
But no, but Medicaid is the U.S. health insurance program for the poor and indigent.
Right. Oh,
So he told my dad, do whatever you need to do. So my dad transferred all his assets into other people's names and claimed Medicaid.
Wow.
And then as I grew older, and paid for my mother's medical bills, and then took all his assets back. And so there was stuff like that going on, and there was stuff in the businesses that were just I didn't agree with. Mm-hmm. And my father would not even countenance a conversation about it.
Right.
So then I was starting to feel like I was going to go crazy at some point, because I was like, I don't agree with this. I'm completely stressed at home because of work, because of family life.
Sorry to cut you off. I was just curious. Were you voicing your distaste of
I did to my dad.
Okay.
About the business, but I really didn't to anyone else. Brenda wouldn't, or sorry, Just nobody. Yeah, it
I
just
got it.
wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I started to feel like I'm gonna snap at some point.
Yeah.
So one day I decided I actually need out for a period of time, a couple of weeks, a few weeks. I need some time away from all this. The drama in the brethren meeting with all the stuff going on, with the crew that got thrown out, my stuff with my dad, stuff with the money, stuff with the businesses, stuff at home, and so I left. And I went to England. So I left a letter, and I'm not proud of what I did, but I just said I've got to get out for a period of time. I'll be in touch. I'll be back. Um,
So when you
and
say you're not proud of what you did, it's because you felt like you abandoned your family?
yeah, I mean, I should have just said, look, I need some time out. I'm gonna take off. I mean, I should
Yeah.
have done it face to face versus a letter.
Right. Okay.
Um,
This is where,
so
by the way, I know this part of the story. I'm not gonna tell it for you. You're gonna tell it, but I just want to let the audience know this is where your story for me not only becomes really kind of riveting for all the wrong reasons, but reminds me a little bit of Richard Marsh. Just in case people are
yeah.
want a little bit of a tease as to what you're about to say, because it's just sort of it goes to show the story you're about to tell what kind of lengths that they will go through to get what they want from people who are sort of disobeying the credo, right?
But not everybody. This is the thing that I've never been able to figure out. They don't
Okay.
do that to everybody. There's
Yeah, I
other
wonder.
people that leave and just vanish, and you never hear from them again, never see them again. Nobody ever, they just disappear into the sunset.
It's when they feel threatened,
Oh, well,
right?
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So go ahead. You decided that you were going to go to London. Yeah.
So I went and made a large cash withdrawal and drove to the airport. And this was obviously pre 9/11. Literally drove to the airport, parked my car, walked into the airport, bought a round trip ticket to London an hour before the flight was supposed to leave,
Mhm.
paid in cash, and walked onto the plane with no luggage. Can you imagine that happening in this day and age? That would never happen.
How much cash did you have on you? Do you remember?
I had about 4 grand
Okay, so you're under the 10 grand that would have caused suspicion.
under the
Yeah.
limit. Yeah. So I went.
I learned. By the way, everybody, I learned that from when Brian Mulroney, our former prime minister in Canada, used to fly to New York and come back home with $9,900 stuffed in envelopes when he was being corrupt over here. So that's how I know that information.
Well,
Go
that
ahead.
was the amount that everyone on the Brethren trips was allowed to take.
9,900, really?
Yeah. You could have $9,900 in cash envelopes on you.
There's like 18 women in bonnets, all with $9,900. And sure, it's just a coincidence, Charlie. Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah.
Strange. Yeah.
So go. So you would land in London.
I land in London. I go. I found it's kind of like a bed and breakfast, but it really wasn't a bed and breakfast. But I mean, in central London, it was right in near Victoria Station. So I check in there, and then I just start walking, and I literally walked and walked and walked. I mean, I walked for miles around central London. Weirdly, really went retraced my steps over and over again. Really became extremely familiar with central London, Victoria, Knightsbridge, Kensington, and kind of Piccadilly area, and went to Charing Cross post office. There was a post office in Charing Cross, which is just off of Trafalgar Square. So I went there, sent a message to my family, both to my dad and to my ex-wife, that I'm fine. I'm just here. And I come out. Long story short, there were brethren following me, and so they had already figured out that I was in London. I don't know how they found that out. They had gotten London or UK brethren on the shtick. They were following me around. There were these goons behind me, like tailing me like some sort of goofy cartoon movie. Um, and I like panicked. I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't know what the fuck's going on. Like, I number one, I told them I was going away. I told them I'd be back in touch. I told them, and this freak show, like they're following me. So I spent one afternoon like ditching them, and I did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which in central London, I don't know if you've been to London, but it's not
I've
that
been
hard.
to I've been to London,
Yeah,
Westminster. I stayed, and I stayed in East London, and
I
it
mean
is a
it's so
very
crowded, it's so
yeah,
busy, it's so
yeah.
jammed. There's so many
Like you have to
alleyways.
literally like dive into the Thames in order to just get away from people.
Yeah.
You know.
So to dump to ditch tails that are not trained is not that hard.
Mm. Yeah.
But then I got panicky that they knew where I was staying, and this is
Mm.
irrational. But I decided I'm not going back to the place I was staying, at least for a while. So I literally slept for I think it was 2 nights, possibly three, on a bench in Hyde Park,
Wow.
so in West London, um, because I was sure I had shaken them, and I thought if I go back to that little hotel where I was staying, they're going to find me again, and I don't know what their plans are. So I slept on this bench, literally this bench, and then on the last morning I was there, I woke up. I thought, well, I'll just go back to the States. Like they think I'm here.
Mhm.
They are looking for me here. I'll just go grab what little shit I have in the hotel, and then I'll go straight to the airport and get on the plane. So that's what I did. And I had bought a bike, which is kind of weird. I'd
Was
bought a
that just
bike.
was that just to confuse them?
I I had bought a
They
bike.
start madly researching the bike trails in London. I don't know what he's doing. Like,
So I literally get this bike. I had it locked to a fence in on this road that runs down from Victoria Station outside the hotel. So I go and unlock the bike, and I get what little shit I had, which was like one bag of stuff. I had some toiletries and things. I get in a black cab, drag my bike into the cab, and the guy's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "No, just don't worry about it." So he
imagine
takes
trying to
me.
explain.
I'm like, don't
Yeah.
talk. So I go to Heathrow. I get on the plane. I check my bike at the luggage claim,
Yeah.
and again, there was so much shit was different pre 9/11. Like you could do all sorts of things with
I know.
airlines.
Yeah.
Like you could literally walk up to the luggage desk with a bicycle and say, "I'm flying back to the States. I have a bike," and they'd
Yeah.
be like, "Oh, sure, like no problem. Like this, yeah, here we are. We'll tag it."
Dude, from Canada, we used to drive down to the States without a passport, without nothing. Like they would just be like, "Oh, hey, white people, go ahead." Like that was
Yeah,
really all it
if
was
you're a
before
white
9/11.
male,
Yeah. Yeah.
everything is good.
That's right.
So I changed my flight back to go to Boston. So
Okay.
I thought I'll go to Boston. So I go to Boston. I land in Boston. I'm going through the immigration line, and they're like, "Come with us." And they look at my passport. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. So I go into this back room, and they said, "Well, you've been reported as a missing person." I'm like, "Well, I'm not missing. I'm like, I've been in touch with my family. I'm clearly fine. I'm not missing." They said, "Okay, well, that's good. They're like noting things on a clipboard."
Yeah.
And then they say, "Well, we're gonna, part of our policy is that we have to advise the person who reported you as missing of where you were made contact with."
Is
And I
that a
was like,
real policy?
"I don't know, but
It
I've heard
sounds
of
like
it
it
from
probably
others."
is, and they knew that, right? Like it's a because I don't think that they would just make that up on the behest at the behest of the brethren.
I
Like it,
think it's a real policy that the brethren knew and
yeah,
used as a way to get a hold of me.
that's what it sounds like. Yeah. Like, were you
Anyway,
able to appeal to them and are all like, listen, these people that are telling you I'm missing don't have my best interest in mind? I'd really appreciate it if you would. No?
no,
No.
it didn't all add up at that point to me.
Right.
Right
Okay.
now, I just wanted to get out of the airport.
Yeah.
So I got out of the airport, claimed my bike. I got in a taxi, took a taxi to Brookline, which was an inner-ring suburb of Boston, and found a room and rented a place, and started walking again. And it sounds so irrational just to be like walking around major cities.
I'm exactly like that. I don't have a driver's license. And
Mm.
I don't like sitting in cars and traffic. I walk everywhere. When I went to New York, I walked from Harlem down to the World Trade Center. Like I was just, I get it. I understand what you mean.
So I was walking. The next day, I'm walking, and I go into South Station, which is the big train station in Boston. Um, I'm walking through this big hall, which is like this big kind of center hall, and I feel a hand on my arm, and I turn, and it's a Brethren guy, and he says it's time to come home. And I was exhausted. I was emotionally exhausted. I was physically exhausted, and I just crumpled, you know.
Yeah.
So we went over to a bench and we sat down. And he said it's time. And he just kept saying it's time to come home. You've got to come home. He was my wife's first cousin. He was another one. So all there's the Brethren are like one massive family. There's very little intermarriage in terms of actual blood relatives marrying,
Right.
but everyone's either your cousin or the cousin of your wife.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Like there's just everyone's cousin.
Yeah.
Um, and he was someone I actually really liked and admired, and I think that was part of the plan, honestly.
Yeah.
I think they figured out where I was. They were following me somehow. They still maintain, that that was complete coincidence that he happened to run into me in the station. That's complete bullshit.
Yeah.
Anyone knows that. But I also believe that they had him come up to me because they knew I would probably least resist him because he was someone I really,
Yeah.
really liked and cared about.
It's smart. Yep.
Um, so they put me on a plane. So he said, "Let's get your stuff."
I got a bike.
And he said, "We're gonna leave the bike."
Yeah.
He actually said,
Yeah.
"We're gonna leave the bike."
But what
So
about? I
someone
just
had
bought
a
it.
really nice bike, a Lincoln bike
Yeah.
in Boston that's about 25 years old, that picked it up somewhere.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we went to my rooms and got my stuff, and he drove me to the airport. He was actually Rick Wilson's brother.
Okay.
Drove me to the airport, put me on a plane,
Did he get
and
on with you?
no, they put me on the plane nonstop to Detroit. And
Yeah.
who should I walk off the plane into the loving arms of but Rick Wilson?
The G. Gordon Liddy of the Plymouth Brethren.
This complete dick. In my view, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fine. What was his name? Dick Wilson.
Well, it could be because
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
a
It's Richard.
nickname.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm your lawyer
So
now.
he says you're very sick. You need to come home and get treatment. So he drives me back to my family home, back with my wife and my then wife and kids. And this Brethren doctor shows up, um, who lived in Detroit and who'd been our family doctor since I was a kid,
Mhm.
And he gives me shots of something, like injections of something. I have no idea what it is. Tells me to
Like a
rest.
like a sedative.
I think now, looking back on it, I mean, he's dead now, and it was only him and I in the room when he was giving me these injections, because this continued over a number of months. So I think it was some sort of sedative,
Yeah.
because he told me you're really ill, you need rest, and this will make you feel better and make you feel more relaxed and allow you time and space to rest and heal. But he wouldn't tell
Docile.
me
It would make you docile. In other words.
it would make me malleable.
Yeah.
Um, so he gave me injections, and he showed up every day for the next, I don't know, 8, 12 weeks, giving me injections. Um,
The Plymouth
yeah,
Brethren have within their employ, or at least within their network, doctors that will do things that would probably get them have them lose their medical license if they did this in
right,
any other
right.
situation. You know,
Well, it used to be Brethren doctors, but
right,
they're all now in their 90s or dead. So they're now hiring other people to do it.
right.
But at that time there was still quite a number of Brethren doctors. I mean, and at one time, like my father's generation, there was all kinds of Brethren doctors, lawyers,
Yeah.
engineers. There was all these people who went to university, which was a huge issue for me growing up, that I couldn't go to university when
Mm.
all my parents, my dad, my uncle, they were all university educated.
Yeah.
They were all like articulate in the ways of the world, and they all knew shit. And anyway, so this next period went on for about 2 years, where I was in and out. I was there in the house for a while, and then I made another attempt at running away to try and get away from I just felt this I felt like this net was around me, so I made an attempt to kind of run. I jumped in the car and took off to Boston again.
That's interesting.
Weirdly,
Because you wanted to get your bike.
I was looking for that damn bike.
I spent £100 on this.
They grabbed me in Boston again within
Ugh.
6 hours of arriving there.
Shit.
Sent me back. Next time I made another run for it, I took the train that came through the suburb we lived in Detroit, to Chicago. And they boarded the fucking train like halfway to Chicago and pulled me off.
How the fuck did they? They must have been tailing you, I guess. Right?
The shit of them tailing people and monitoring people's stuff has been going on literally. My dad they were doing it in the 50s,
Yeah.
in the 60s.
I've seen, who was I talking to? Craig Hoyle. And he was talking about reading his grandparents' diaries from the 1920s. And they were doing this type of shit.
They've been doing this stuff. So a lot of the stuff is not new. The money,
Right.
the whole sort of commercialization of the Brethren is relatively new.
Yeah.
But most of the other stuff and most of the stuff, this has all been going on for literally generations.
Yeah.
So they pulled me off the train. They brought me back home. So that time I figured, okay, this time I'm gonna have to plan. So the doctor at that,
Sorry, it's funny when you say it like that. Instead of just randomly getting on a train, I'm gonna have to, did you have to use like almost a what do you call that? A decoy? I'm going to Florida and then head on over to Wisconsin or whatever.
no, well the last time they brought me home, they took away everything. They took my wallet, my driver's license, my passport, my credit. Well, we didn't have credit cards. I had a debit card. They took everything away. My checkbook, so I couldn't access anything. So I'm like, okay, well, I still was convinced that I needed to get out, but that I would have to plan this a little bit more carefully. At some point, I don't really remember how or when, but maybe it was when they were all, I think, because they were all still going to the meetings and stuff, and I was just like in bed, supposedly tranquilized. And I found my wallet and my passport and everything.
Oh, nice.
So I'm like, oh, okay, now I know where it is hidden. It had not been removed from the house. It had just been secreted kind of behind some stuff and
Yeah.
some books and things. So then I planned, and the next time I went, I literally went in the night, like in the dark of night,
Yeah.
and I just stayed in Detroit. I just went and got a room at a motel, and went and got a job right away at a hotel, and then within about a week found an apartment. I got an apartment in like the most dark and dangerous part of the ghetto of Detroit,
Perfect.
because I thought they're not going to come there.
Yeah. That's right. You use their
Um,
rate. That's it. Well, that's what you have to do, right? You use their racism against them, right? Like they're
yeah,
not gonna.
and
Yeah.
bought furniture from like the Salvation Army,
Mhm.
and yeah, But then they started to harass me at work. So they would like lay in. At my first job in the hotel business was working as a night, on the night shift. So they would like lay in wait. So I would like be walking into work at like 10 to 11, and they would like jump out of their cars and like block my entrance into the hotel.
Yeah.
And finally, I'm like, you guys have got to stop. Like I said to Rick, I'm like, I'm going to file for a protection order against you if you don't stop, because now you're harassing me. It's just this is nonsense. So they kind of left me alone, and then I just kind of went on with my life, and I moved quickly through in the hotel business. I moved fairly soon after that. I moved to Chicago, got a good job there. Went to Germany. I could speak German. I had taken German in my school, and then I took some additional classes and moved to Germany. Got a job in Germany. I actually went to university in Germany for a while. I thought I wanted
Oh,
to become.
nice.
There was a period.
You thought you wanted to become what, sorry?
A minister.
Oh,
I thought I wanted to study theology.
that was
So
just guilt.
I studied theology at Bonn,
Yeah.
which is a university in Germany, and then just kind of decided that wasn't really my shtick. But I loved living in Germany, and then after a few years, moved to the UK, lived there for a number of years, working in the hotel business. And then in 2007 or 8, I got an email. So the review happened, and there was all this stuff about, I got this call from the new priestly order in Detroit. The old regime was out. The new guys were in.
That's when it went from
It was from John Hales to
John
Bruce.
Hales to Bruce Hales. Yeah. And
Yeah,
Bruce Hales, ever the rebellious kid, brought drinking back with a vengeance.
yeah,
Yeah.
bizarre.
Yeah.
But they called me and told me that they were sorry that they had withdrawn from me, and that they felt I had been treated as harshly as anyone could have been treated, and that they felt badly, and that I was their friend, and that if ever I wanted to chat, to call them, if I was ever back in the States, to give them a jingle, and we could hang out. One of them was one of my cousins, um, and it was just so bizarre. It was so weird.
Yeah.
So I did go back to the States around this time and went and visited my parents, and they were the same. You're welcome in our house anytime. You're welcome to. Would you like to stay here? And then my ex-wife asked to see me. She came. She apologized for the way things had gone. It was just this big love fest, like hugs, loves,
Oh, it's a mind fuck, isn't it?
and then I kind of universally said it's a little late, a little late, a
Yeah.
little late.
Yeah.
Um, kind of pretty happy where I am. Got lots going on. It is a mind fuck though.
What about your kids?
So I saw them. That was probably the last time I saw them actually. And they were fine. They were but they would never let me see them without a priest there, which
How
was not
that's so condescending, eh? Like,
just weird. Like some, you know, overweight white brethren man watching everything that was said or done. It's just so bizarre.
we
Anyway,
only have like maybe 10 minutes left. Can I just ask you just quickly? No, really.
jeez, I've taken up all the time.
No, but you know what? I could probably go for another hour. But I think we have a show coming up. But I was going to ask you though specifically because this is the only way I can relate to any of the stories that I hear from ex-members is if I close my eyes and have a cathartic experience of what it would be like to be forcefully separated from my children. And I want to know how you've been able to handle that emotion over the past however many years.
It's very, very hard. very hard. And it starts out as kind of this throbbing, searing pain. Um, and is actually quite debilitating, and a lot allows or makes you do things that you don't want to do. You might drink too much, or you might do drugs, but over time you sort of make peace with it, and it just becomes more of like that arm or ankle you broke a few years ago that's just really achy.
Yeah.
Some days it's more achy than others. Um, but I still dream about it probably every other night. I still dream about them. Um, it's very much a reality, but it's not a present reality that anyone around me knows, you know. But
Is there a weird I want to see how to put this properly. Is there almost a very ironic silver lining to know that the uh, the fact that they've been brought up inside a cult like that makes them less susceptible, perhaps, to longing for you, so that they don't suffer as much? Am I totally off base, or?
I don't think you are. Um, I think there are some things. I think their mother is an incredible woman. I
Mhm.
think she was an incredible mother to them. So they had that. I think they had a very uh, materially comfortable upbringing, and I think they're all very strong believers in the system. And I think that gives them comfort and sustenance. You know.
Yeah.
I was recently on a talking to someone who knows them fairly well, who only recently left, and and she spoke about how poisoned the kids are against me. The Brethren are masters at constructing narratives about people who left.
Yeah.
They don't need to be true narratives. They don't need to be factually based, but they construct narratives about almost everyone who leaves, or everyone that at least that they feel threatened by, or that they feel is a threat to them.
Mhm.
And they construct these narratives about them. And I mean, the shit that I've heard about myself, I'm like, if only my life were that interesting.
Yeah.
If, if only,
I'm the guy that bought a bike in London for no reason at all. Like, how could you believe
yeah,
this shit?
yeah. If only I could have been this drama. Like, wow, geez, dang. I wish I knew that person because that life sounds super interesting. Um,
What is your life like now?
my life, like right now, is really wonderful. Actually, 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, on June 1st, it'll be 4 years. Married a wonderful, wonderful woman. I have two wonderful stepchildren.
Nice.
One is 18, and one is 14. Uh, I live in Western New York, so upstate in Western New York near Buffalo. We own a business that is a restaurant and inn, because for the last 20 some years that's all I've done. So we have a very busy little place here doing restaurant and inn stuff, making meals and making
Yeah.
beds.
It'd be a good
Uh,
place for an ex Brethren conference. Seems
yes,
like,
it
you
would
know?
be. Would be. It's very centrally located.
Yeah.
And then we have we also have a home in Michigan, in northern Michigan, where my wife is from. And we have a design business there. My wife is an architect and a landscape architect.
Nice. That
It's kind
explains the beautiful shelves behind you, doesn't
of, yeah, she's probably the preeminent landscape architect in northern Michigan.
it? Mm.
So we have a very busy design business there. Um, so we go back and forth a lot. We do a lot of traveling through Ontario, um, between Michigan and New York. But
Yeah.
life is good. Life is incredibly busy. There's
Yeah.
never, there's very little moments to catch your breath, but that's okay. Uh, there'll be time later to slow down, and
Well,
but
listen.
I have a
You're,
wonderful circle of friends. One of my best friends that I made after I left the Brethren, was actually a student minister in the Presbyterian. Well, he was the Church of Scotland, and then he was interning here in the Presbyterian Church. He knew the brethren very well from his growing up in Scotland, but he's one of my oldest friends. And another really great friend, in doing genealogical research, found out he's my 10th cousin. So
Oh, nice.
a really great circle of friends, wonderful wife and kids, and just really, life is good.
Well, good, because there's nothing better than to hear an ex-member talk about where their life is now and that it's a positive force. Your story is really riveting. I find it very compelling, and I like that it's come full circle. You had a sheltered childhood, and maybe there were some things or whatever, but it seems like the bookends of your life has been the happiest parts of your life, and I think that should be something to be proud of because of everything that you went through. Bradley McCallum, thank you very much for joining us tonight on Blackballed. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, James. I
You have a
appreciate
good
talking
night,
to you.
sir.
Yep, thank you.
Wow, I can't even imagine the 5 kids thing. I always get hung up on the children thing about and then imagining myself in the dark of the night, like kidnapping all my kids, running to Colombia or some shit. But that was Bradley McCallum's story is very, very riveting. I don't have my schedule in front of me, but I know I have another podcast tomorrow at 8 o'clock. And then Thursday as well. I also have famous novelists. I'll see if my